Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. Boston University students, faculty, leadership, alumni, friends, and listeners to this great new city space here at WBUR. I'm proud to welcome all of you to the inaugural Paul Streeten Distinguished Lecture in Global Development Policy that celebrates the example and legacy of Boston University professor Paul Streeten. My name's Kevin Gallagher. I'm a professor at the Pardee School for Global Studies, and I direct the Global Development Policy Center here, or the Gdp Center as we like to call it. The Gdp Center is pleased to co-sponsor this event with the Department of Economics and their Institute for Economic Development. Before I introduce our distinguished guests, who we chose to be the inaugural recipient of the Streeten Lectureship, the Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, please allow me to say a few words about Paul Streeten and the history and trajectory of development policy here at BU. Following Professor Stiglitz's remarks, my colleague Dilip Mukherjee and I will lead us in a question and answer session with Professor Stiglitz, and we'll have a short reception out here to follow. And before I start, I really want to thank WBUR City Space, the BU Department of Alumni Relations, the staff at the Department of Economics, and the GDP Center for all the hard work they did to make this happen and to get all of you into this room. Paul Streeten, Professor Emeritus at BU's Department of Economics, died on January 6th, 2019, at the age of 101. His wife of 67 years, Ann Streeten, predeceased him just by a few months. He's survived by 2 daughters, a stepson, 2 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren, and we're really proud to establish this lectureship in his honor. Sitting in these 2 seats right here are supposed to be Tish and Thule, his daughter and granddaughter, but they had tickets on WOW Airlines from Iceland. And despite what WOW says, they did not get everybody where they were supposed to be. The GDP Center staff's been trying to get them here since 10 o'clock yesterday, so we're really sad that we don't have members of the Streeten family with us today. Paul Streeten was born in Vienna, Austria. He served in World War II and went on to teach at Oxford, the University of Sussex, where he co-founded and directed the renowned Institute for Development Studies, and later became professor of economics here at BU from 1980 to 1993, where he was the founder and director of the World Development Institute. Streeten made significant contributions to economic theory of industry and trade, published his work in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the Review of Economic Studies, the Journal of International Economics, and the American Economic Review. He also founded what has become the world's leading interdisciplinary journal in development studies, World Development. His groundbreaking scholarly books, such as First Things First, Meeting Basic Human Needs in the Developing Countries, and Thinking About Development, continue to be influential to this day. As is the tradition here at Boston University, Paul Streeten put his academic work into action. He served as Deputy Director General of the United Kingdom's Ministry of Overseas Development. He was senior advisor to the World Bank and helped to formulate the bank's policies on basic needs during the 1970s. And his scholarly work led the foundations to what later became the United Nations Human Development Index, which emphasized the importance of education and human health as essential components of the development process. He remained active well after his retirement, continuing to speak around the world and expanding the domain of development economics into environmental sustainability, governance, and beyond. He came back in 2010, and he was a visiting professor at the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future, where he lectured on globalization and technology. This is going to be an annual prize, and it really has 3 goals. One, and first and foremost, it honors the impact and legacy of Paul Streeten's scholarship and policy engagement. Second, the lectureship seeks to shine light on scholars working in a Streeten tradition who pursue rigorous scientific work while connecting with other disciplines in the policy community to advance better development outcomes. And third, the lectureship hopes to inspire younger scholars to pursue interdisciplinary research on pressing development problems and engage actively with the policy community. Paul Streeten is part of a long legacy and strong trajectory on development here at BU. It all began back in 1953, just as the field of development was being founded, with the opening of the African Studies Center, which is now housed at the Pardee School of Global Studies. The African Studies Center has provided a strong foundation in African studies to generations of BU students and professors, as well as development practitioners and diplomats to this day. In economics, the legacy starts when Paul Rosenstein Rodin one of the pioneers of development economics, established the Center for Latin American Studies here in 1974. This was followed by the formation of other regional development centers and then the launch of Streeten's World Development Institute. Rosenstein-Rodin, Streeten, and colleagues such as Gus Papanak, who is here with us today, were tapped by presidents in the United States and abroad to help devise development strategies. And their work remains enshrined in development economics textbooks and in numerous BU alum who went on to become finance ministers, development bankers, and academics in their own right. It would be remiss not to mention the late John Harris, a distinguished professor in the economics department who passed away last year. His article on the determinants of migration and urban unemployment was chosen as one of the top economics papers of all time. In more recent decades, the department and the IED, the Institute for Economic Development, continue to build on and advance this legacy. Dilip Mukherjee's done pioneering work on the political economy of decentralization, on property rights, credit frictions, and inequality with various co-authors. Andy Newman's work on matching, inequality, segregation is quite notable as well, and the list goes on. The tradition of policy-oriented development research subsequently expanded across the university as the understanding of the key elements of the development process have expanded as well over the years. Perhaps one of the most dynamic hubs of development policy research over the past few decades has been at BU's School of Public Health, especially but not limited to the Department of Global Health there. This year, the Questrom School of Business will celebrate 40 years of Hubert Humphrey Fellows, young professionals from emerging market and developing country, finance ministries, central banks, and the private sector who come to BU for a year. One important graduate of the Humphrey Fellows program, Jin Lachun, is now the president of the newly formed Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I'll end with the newest kid on the block, the Gdp Center. We're administered by the Vice President and Associate Provost for Research, Gloria Waters, who's here with us, and the Pardee School of Global Studies. The newish Pardee School puts advancing human progress and policy engagement at the core of what we do. Our Dean, Adil Najam, who's here, way in the back. We have a seat for you in the front. Practices what he preaches from the very top of our school. He was the lead author of last year's Human Development Report for his native Pakistan. The mission of the GDP Center is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment across the world. And we've established 4 research initiatives on human capital, land use and livelihoods, global economic governance, and something we call the Global China Initiative. Our core faculty are economists, geographers, political scientists, biostatisticians, and legal scholars. In just a couple of years, the GDP Center has published rigorous academic work in top social and natural science journals on the economics of HIV/AIDS, on women, migration, and remittances in Indonesia, on the impacts of policy interventions on maternal health in Malawi, on the scale and impact of Chinese overseas development finance, on the factors that determine farmers' decisions to deforest in the Amazon, and on the impact of trade and investment treaties on access to essential medicines. We've also engaged many graduate students from across the university and across the world and have something called a Summer in the Field program. You just missed the deadline for it, unfortunately, where we send master's students and undergrads abroad to work with development organizations. But we only start there. Last year, we were inaugurated by Ban Ki-moon, who tasked us to not only be a university-based think tank, but also to be a do tank that advances scholarly work out into the policy community to try to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. And to that end, we've done a lot already. Jacob Bohr's econometric work showing that investment in secondary schools reduces the incidence of HIV/AIDS, what he calls a social vaccine, has led to a multi-million-dollar program to build schools across sub-Saharan Africa. Sam Bauzi is working with the Indonesian Agency for the Placement and Protection of Indonesian Workers to improve the choices and information to female migrant workers overseas. Suchi Gopal, Julie Klinger, and Rebecca Ray are working with indigenous groups and civil society in the Andean Amazon and in the Mekong to better equip them to mitigate the impacts of large development projects on their ecology and livelihoods. Bill Grimes, William Kring, and Perry Merling, who we're excited to have here and who joins us to set up a new program on central banking and financial stability, have participated in G20 commissions to reform global economic governance institutions. If you know anything about Professor Joseph Stiglitz, by now you will understand why perhaps he, more than anyone else in his profession, exemplifies rigorous academic achievement with sound theory-driven and evidence-based policy advice on economic development in what you might call a Streeten tradition. Joseph Stiglitz was born in a steel town of Gary, Indiana, studied at Amherst College, and later obtained his PhD in economics from MIT. He's taught at Yale, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, and Oxford, and he's now a university professor at Columbia University in New York. One of his early papers, Alternative Theories of Wage Determination and Unemployment in Less Developing Countries, was completed while he was at the Institute for Development Studies in Nairobi while working alongside John Harris, the late John Harris from the economics department. Professor Stiglitz has done path-breaking work on the economics of the public sector, the economics of uncertainty, growth, technological change and distribution, and industrial organization. Within his profession, however, Professor Stiglitz is most known for his work on asymmetric information. In a nutshell, when one party to an economic transaction has more knowledge than another, then market institutions can break down or fail. Unfortunately, almost all economic transactions involve some form of information asymmetries at some level, as Professor Stiglitz himself has shown in insurance markets, financial markets, labor markets, and in the monetary system. His collective body of work in this area poses fundamental challenges to some of the underpinnings of modern economic theory and the policies governing market economies. This may sound a little shocking, and I hope it's not insulting, because it's not meant to be. But as incredible and unrivaled as this academic work is, we would not ask Joe Stiglitz to be the inaugural Streeten lecture solely on that basis. Professor Stiglitz already has had no better recognition for this outstanding academic work than in 2001, when he was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, and before that, the John Bakes Clark Medal in 1979. The Paul Streeten Lectureship goes to an economist who has not only made major contributions to the discipline, but to someone who also engages in policies based on such research. As a direct outgrowth of his work on asymmetric information and other matters, Professor Stiglitz has, and I'm only going to mention a few because I could speak longer than his talk will be, has partnered with native Seneca Indians to calculate the magnitude by which they had been cheated in previous years. He worked with the Natural Resources Defense Council to calculate the cost of U.S. offshore oil tracts and their impacts on the environment. In 1992, Professor Stiglitz became a member and later chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and later senior vice president for development policy and chief economist at the World Bank. Upon leaving the World Bank, Professor Stiglitz has written best-selling books that expand his insights and experience to a broader audience, thus deepening the global policy discourse in economic policy. His first book in this vein, Globalization and Its Discontents, became an international bestseller for showing how the International Monetary Fund and the United States Treasury forced developing countries to deregulate their financial markets, even though such policies had little theoretical basis or empirical support in the economics profession. He has since written some of the definitive books on the financial crisis, inequality, the euro crisis, globalization and trade, the list goes on. His latest book is called People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism in an Age of Discontent, and it's due out later this month by Norton. He's chaired numerous high-level commissions. Somehow he's the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute, and of course he's established the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, which is one of the foremost university-based think tanks on development policy in the world. To honor the impact of and legacy of Paul Streeten's scholarship and policy engagement, to shine light on scholars working in the Streeten tradition, and to inspire younger scholars to research pressing development problems and engage with the policy community, friends at Boston University, I introduce to you Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, thank you for that very flattering, wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here at BU, where there's been a long tradition in development. Gus Papanek and John Harris and obviously Paul Streeten. I don't want to spend much time talking about Paul Streeten's work. I didn't know Paul well, but one of his basic contributions to development economics was this idea of basic needs that broadened perspective beyond traditional economics and reflected the kind of humanity that that this lectureship it calls attention to. Over time, it's had an enormous amount of influence. It evolved, particularly under the influence of Marxism, into something called the capabilities approach. And that was then embedded in the HDI, the Human Development Index, which is a standard way in which people look at how well different countries are doing, which tries to get beyond just looking at GDP or income and bring in other aspects like health and education. So it's a real pleasure for me to be here to honor Paul Streeten. What I want to, the topic I'm going to talk about is, as I say, multilateralism and development. And let me, I got it. Okay. Okay. Let me begin by just summarizing the main messages I want to talk about. And that is that multilateralism is of crucial importance, especially for development. The United States led in the period after World War II in creating the rules-based international order, but unfortunately now is leading to its destruction. But an important lesson for other countries is that multilateralism is too important to be allowed to be destroyed by any single country, let alone any single individual. And finally, this being an important research institution, I think there is an important research agenda to be done to understand better the appropriate set of rules for global economic governance. So let me begin by talking a little bit about some of the changing perspectives on multilateralism. Before, the global system was criticized as being unfair to developing countries and emerging markets. That was the point of my earlier book, Globalization and Its Discontents. There were problems of governance, insufficient voice, unfair rules, assistance that was accompanied by inappropriate conditionalities, and the monetary and other policies of the large systemic countries like the United States and the EU were undertaken with little regard to the consequences elsewhere, especially among emerging markets and developing countries. When the United States, in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, undertook QE, quantitative easing, they didn't pay any attention to the impact it would have on developing countries, the Russia money coming into those countries, which had a very destabilizing effect. And some of them said, well, that was their problem, not the United States, that we should focus just on what's good for the United States. Well, now the world confronts an unraveling of multilateralism, an undermining of the rules-based trading system, and more broadly, the international rule of law, and cooperative efforts to address global problems that can only be solved by multilateralism, the most important being climate change, but also all the rules that, nuclear proliferation, all the rules that are, all the things that affect all of us globally are only going to be solved by global action, multilateralism. And the reason that within a country that we have rules of law is that it is basic to the way we can interact with each other. And one of the important things, that the reason we are so much better off than we were 250 years ago is that we've learned how to cooperate and to work together at a large scale. In an agrarian economy, you didn't need that kind of cooperation. You were a farmer, an isolated farmer. But as we become a complex society, industrial, post-industrial society, you need cooperation. And for that cooperation to work, you need rules. And that's why the foundation of the rule of law. But as we become a global society, we need rules as well. And that is the foundation of why we need an international rule of law. It's obviously difficult because We don't have an international real government. We have the UN, who facilitates cooperation. So still the basic unit is the nation state. And that makes global governance more difficult, global economics more difficult. But it is still the case that the only approach to having a successful world is multilateralism. And it should be obvious that brute power politics is even worse than unbalanced multilateralism and will be particularly disadvantageous for developing countries and emerging markets. And that really is the premise that the current administration is pursuing, that because it is bigger than most other countries, in the absence of a rule of law, it will win out. But I think that is wrong because it ignores the possibility of the fact that we are a place that will be less trustworthy, less stable for doing international business because it isn't part of the international rule of law. So what is particularly disturbing is, as I said before, that U.S. played a key role in establishing the system. But it wasn't just a matter of altruism. It also served U.S. interests. The problems presented by globalization, for instance, deindustrialization, are not the result of unfair international rules or others taking advantage of the U.S. Sometimes you get the impression that the current administration thinks that previous administrations were snookered by very smart trade ministers from developing countries. But I can tell you that's not true. The basic fact is that those international agreements were basically written by the United States. EU had a little role in it. And when I say by the United States, mostly by our corporate interests. And that is the problem, because they weren't written by you and me, they weren't written through a very democratic process, but they were written by the United States. So the problem wasn't with being snookered by other countries, the problem was with what we wanted, what our USTR, what our trade negotiators wanted, and what they were interested, as I'll explain a little bit later, is basically advancing their own commercial corporate interests. The problems that we've been seeing, the deindustrialization of large parts of America, is really a result of our failure to help in restructuring of the U.S. economy. The absence, for instance, of industrial and active labor market policies to help people move from jobs that are being destroyed to jobs that are being created, and inadequate systems of social protection. The fact is that other countries have done a lot better job. So it isn't globalization that is the problem. Globalization is a global phenomena. But other countries, particularly, for instance, the Scandinavian countries, have done a lot better job of helping people move from the jobs that are being destroyed to the new jobs that are being created, and making sure that new jobs are being created and they're created in places where the people are. So the lesson is that protectionism and the retreat from multilateralism won't solve the problems of deindustrialization and the other problems that we're facing, and I think it will actually make them worse. What we need is systems of social protection without protectionism. And that was the motivation of my writing a book, coming out with a new version of the book that he referred to, called Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited, Anti-Globalization in the Era of Trump. So after Trump started going, I couldn't help but revisit these issues and try, not that I expected him to read it, but maybe somebody around him might read it and understand where they were going wrong. So it was my attempt to help the country. Well, these problems have many manifestations, and I'll talk about a few of them, in particular trade. The seriousness of the problem can't be underestimated. We all know about the trade conflict with China. That's gotten a lot of the headlines. But something that hasn't gotten very much headlines is the WTO is about to be disempowered. A key part of the WTO, which was a multilateral rules-based system, a key part is a system of adjudicating disputes. In any trade relationship, you're going to have disputes. And a rule of law says you have to have a way of fairly adjudicating those disputes. And the WTO created what has turned out to be, I think most people think, is a reasonably well-performing set of courts, you can call it, appellate bodies. Well, the United States has refused to allow the appointment of new judges as the old judges retire. By the end of this year, there will not be a quorum in the WTO appellate body, and the WTO will not be able to adjudicate disputes. So this is really a serious threat to the international rule of law, done not without fanfare, just very quietly under the radar screen, but with devastating effects. As I mentioned before, the U.S. believes it has advantage in bilateral negotiations with smaller countries. It has a misconceived focus on bilateral trade deficits. I hope all of you who are students understand that what matters is the multilateral trade deficit, and that the multilateral trade deficit is basically determined by the disparity between domestic investment and domestic savings, and that because of the tax bill that was signed, really the worst tax bill ever, signed in December of 2017, and the increase in expenditures in January 2018, it was predictable that the trade deficit, the multilateral trade deficit, would go up. And that's exactly what's happened. It's reached new record levels. So while he's talking about renegotiating trade deals, bilateral trade agreements, that will affect whether we import clothes from China or from Vietnam. That won't make any difference for jobs in America. But the multilateral trade deficit, which he began by talking about, will actually be worse. But there are other manifestations of this withdrawal from multilateralism. The withdrawal from the Paris climate change is extraordinarily serious. The good news is that California, New York, a lot of cities, a lot of corporations are saying, we don't care if Trump withdraws, we are going to still meet our obligations. And private philanthropists have stepped forward and met the U.S. Obligations in terms of supporting the Secretariat. But there's also equally serious withdrawal from efforts to contain nuclear proliferation. That, again, is a global public good. We don't want to burn up a nuclear holocaust, and only can be done through multilateral. The agreements may be imperfect, but as one person said, a leaky umbrella, it protects you a little bit on a rainy day. It's better to have that than no umbrella at all. So these agreements, I think, are important. The effects of the trade war are already manifest. The global slowdown that's going on is partly attributed to the impact of the uncertainty on investment. And you see this, I just came back from China a couple of days ago, and it's very clear that the uncertainty has made everybody, they don't know whether to invest in China, to invest somewhere else. And the same thing is true in the United States. So all this uncertainty is bad for the economy. The actual shock to the global economy from a trade war with China would be even greater. But what has happened with the undermining of agreements, the leaving Iran agreement when there was no real basis for it, the other withdrawal from agreements, is that not even an agreement would resolve the uncertainty. No agreement can resolve many of the underlying issues. Maybe in the discussion we may come to that. But it has meant that the U.S. policy is largely unpredictable. And Trump has shown little hesitancy in going back on agreements. And this exacerbates some fundamental uncertainties that we were facing in any case, which is of returning to normal after the Great Recession. Let me just make a slight aside about the new trade agreements. There are two agreements that have been completed. One is the Korea-U.S. agreement, and the other one is the agreement with Mexico and Canada. And if you look at the details, you realize how minor. He said these were the worst agreements ever, and if they were the worst agreements ever, the fact that you could change them by moving a comma, make them the best agreement ever, calls into question his first statement. The Korean, there are just a couple of things in the Korea agreement. One of them was Korea has higher car safety standards, and under the previous agreement, they allow 25,000 unsafe American cars into Korea. But the Koreans didn't want to buy them. So while they allowed them, the constraint wasn't binding because nobody wanted to buy them. So the new agreement says that now Koreans can buy 50,000 cars, which they won't buy. So it's made a big difference. There was another provision that actually took it took central banks by surprise, because it said that basically Korea had to coordinate its monetary policy with the United States. Evidently, it was a provision that was put in with nobody in the Federal Reserve or anybody else being consulted on it, and had no enforcement mechanisms, so it won't make any difference. It caused a little bit of anxiety among other central bankers. It got absolutely no attention anywhere. As far as I'm sure none of you know about this. It was just one of the central bankers in Asia was very, very upset about it. But he was, as far as I know, the only person who knew about this. So that was one. That was the Korea-U.S. agreement. The agreement between Mexico and Canada has a couple of provisions, but are relatively small adjustments, especially on trade. There are a couple things that are important. There were, in the area of pharmaceuticals, it was trying to rebalance, make it more difficult for generics, in particular in biologics. So it's rebalancing for big pharma. It was a big pharma bill relative to generics. Well, there are a number of detailed other provisions that we may have time to talk about later, but the fact is that it's not a big deal. But while the trade agreements the new trade agreements are not a big deal, the impacts of the changed U.S. attitudes will be longstanding. As I mentioned before, U.S. has been the champion of multilateralism, and what the U.S. has now done has reminded everyone borders still matter. The nation state is still the basic unit, and that if you're a large country, you can just walk away from agreements almost with impunity. There are three other things that have been warnings to other countries engaging in negotiations with the U.S., and I can tell you the negotiators are very aware of this. It doesn't tell them what to do, but it just increases their anxiety. One of them is that what is agreed by the negotiator may not be accepted by Trump. On two occasions, or more than two occasions, China and the United States reached an agreement, and they brought the agreement back to the United States. It was a reasonable agreement. They thought they had made major concessions, and then Trump said no. He wanted tariffs. He wanted a trade war. And what is agreed one day may not be acceptable the next day. It's also the case that ratification by Congress remains problematic. And the third thing is that U.S. can breaks agreements with impunity. So the bottom line is that developing countries will have to live with a great deal of uncertainty. And this is a time this is a time of great macroeconomic certainty with slowdown in China, weaknesses in Europe, and slowdown in the United States. But given the limited amount of time, I'm going to not talk about those particular uncertainties, but move on to a set of issues focusing on development, and that is the dangers of increasing debt. One of the ways that developing countries, when you're a developing country, you need resources. And I'm going to talk about the various ways they get resources. One of the ways they get resources is by borrowing. And one of the problems of borrowing is sometimes you can't pay back what you borrow. And the question is, what happens when you can't pay back what you borrow? And it's always a question about who's to blame. The lender, in my mind, is often much more informed, often more sophisticated than the borrower. And so in a sense that any contract, a loan between a willing lender and a willing borrower, the lender is as much to blame as the borrower. But putting aside the issue of blame, the question is when you can't repay, what happens? Well, we know what used to happen when countries couldn't repay. You send your army in, and you solve the problem that way. England took over the Suez Canal, the Suez Canal in Egypt, and one of our earlier encounters, people have forgotten, a little over 100 years ago, with Venezuela was when Venezuela failed to repay its debt. And gunboats went down to Venezuela and started shooting. And there was a general view that wasn't quite civilized way of dealing with it. Within our countries, the way we deal with it, we have bankruptcy laws. We say, if you can't repay, they used to, in the UK, you would go to debtor's prison. But being in prison was not a good way of being able to repay your debt. And we figured that out. It took us 100 years or so, but we sent some people to Australia. UK sent some people to Australia. But anyway, the point is that we become more civilized, we think, and we don't have debtor's prison, and we have bankruptcy provisions. And we want, the bankruptcy provisions are supposed to maintain the economy, not destroy assets. And quite often, the creditor gets back more in an organized bankruptcy than certainly than in a debtor prison. Well, internationally, we don't have any way of resolving debt. So there is no adequate framework for sovereign debt resolution. In the case of many of the poor countries, the developing countries, they had so much debt that it was really impeding their development. That all their money was going to pay the creditors. And so at the turn of the century, we had an initiative called HIPC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries, where we gave debt forgiveness. It's only been 19 years since that debt forgiveness, actually less than that because it took a while. And many developing countries are back into high levels of debt. And the last major debt crisis in a developing country, emerging market, was Argentina, 2001. Greece has had a problem. So there have been other countries. At the time of the Argentina crisis, there was a recognition that we ought to have a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, some way like an international bankruptcy law. So that required multilateralism. We had to come together and say, what are how do we resolve this debt problem? But unfortunately, back then, the United States again vetoed this international effort. I'm not quite sure what the motivation was. Well, I think I do know. The creditors, many of whom were in New York and the United States, thought they could do better by using brute force. And the vulture funds, who are buy the debt and speculate on it, were particularly influential in the Bush administration, and they said, don't have a rule of law, let it be a jungle. And in that jungle, since we're stronger, we'll beat them up. And that view, I think, is obviously not one that any development likes, nor is it actually one that is actually good for the capital market. Anybody concerned about because it creates a lot of uncertainty. So there, in the aftermath of some of the consequences of the Argentina crisis that went on for more than a decade, resolving their debt, there was a global effort to create a sovereign debt framework. And it was centered at our most important multilateral institution, the UN. And they adopted a set of principles for a framework for sovereign debt restructuring. It was almost unanimous, but unfortunately, the opposition were a couple large countries, most importantly, the United States. And so while there's been these principles and there's a lot of discussion about how to go forward, it's very difficult with the opposition in the United States for this to go forward. On the slide, I have a couple of technical points. The U.S. has said, well, all you need is something called collective action clauses, which are rules about how the debtors get together and a majority can vote. But that won't work. If they were, we wouldn't need a bankruptcy law within the country. So the fact is that the not having a multilateral system is really very costly. And it's another example of U.S. trying to undermine multilateralism. My view is with more of global savings coming from emerging markets, they, working with a coalition of willing developed countries, should take more leadership in shaping the global financial system and work out a way of dealing with the debt. Now, similar issues can be raised with respect to lots of the other aspects of financing development. And I'll talk very briefly about four of these: taxation, private flows, public flows, and what I call curbing the reverse flows. The issue of taxation has become very much at the center of policy debate. In many cases, emerging countries and developing countries markets and developing countries are not getting the taxes they should be getting from multinational corporations. That is to say, they're not getting the taxes reflecting the economic activity that occurs within their country. There's been a lot of innovation by American firms, particularly in tax avoidance. And some of our most innovative firms in other areas have been as innovative or even more innovative in tax avoidance and evasion. The Apple, which many of you have, is become emblematic of tax avoiders. In Europe, they did the famous deal with Ireland, where all the profits of Europe went to a Irish subsidiary, and then they took advantage of another provision of Irish law, which was that if the Irish subsidiary was controlled outside of Ireland, it didn't face any taxes. So the net tax paid by Apple on its profits in Europe was about 0.05 of 1%. I think it was just a token. I don't know why they paid even that amount, but I guess they had to persuade Ireland that they could get something out of it. But Starbucks, Google are all competing in the sphere of tax avoidance to see who can figure out these. And they have very clever names, the double Dutch, the Irish sandwich, and so on. It's a race to the bottom, and I think the developing countries need to work together to reach agreement against such harmful tax competition. I can't help but mention, because Apple tried the same thing within the United States to get tax competition between New York, all the cities of where they would locate their second headquarters. And at first, New York fell for it and gave them $1 billion, several tax rebate. Well, the fact is that tax is going to be borne by other people and gives them an unlevel playing field. So, and so the question is, should that tax competition be allowed? In Europe, the view is very strongly no. That was called state aid, and it unlevels the playing field, and that's what caught Apple. It wasn't the tax competition of low rates, it was the special deals that they were getting. Well, the international community has agreed that there should be a initiative called the base to try to curb this. It's called the BEPS, or Base Erosion Profit Shifting. The idea is shifting your profits to low tax jurisdictions. And as I say, Starbucks did this really well for franchise fees. You can do it through intellectual property. And there's a major effort at reaching a new consensus in a direction that would deprive developing countries of needed revenue. And that's this destination-based cash flow tax, which means basically not taxing where the production occurs, but taxing where the sales occurs, which would be very bad for emerging markets and developing countries. So the reforms are now realizing that there's a fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is with the transfer system of multinational taxation. The transfer pricing system says that when you move goods across the border, you value the output as if it were an arm's length transaction, what a market transaction. But there is no market for a chip for a way for all of these things to occur inside a firm, There's no market for a shirt without a sleeve or a collar. There's no, so you gives you enormous discretion in choosing your prices. And that's why within the United States, as goods move back and forth across the states all the time, no one would pretend that we ought to have a transfer price system. We use what is called a formulaic system. And that is where those who are trying to reform the multilateral corporate tax system are saying once you have global integration, you have to move away from this transfer price system into the formulaic system. There are some hopeful notes. Some countries are thinking about imposing a minimum global tax, motivated by outrage at tax avoidance and evasion. And if that were done, it would enable developing countries to raise tax rates up to the minimum level without adverse economic effects. And right now, Europe, many countries of Europe are thinking about imposing a broad digital tax. So let me come to a little bit the problems in global, in private capital flows. And here I want to focus most particularly on short-term flows. One of the problems is that there is a certain short-termism. Much of the savings in our economy is long-term. People saving for their retirement, sovereign wealth funds, saving for perpetuity. And much of the investment needs are long-term. Investment needs in infrastructure, as an example. But it's standing in between our short-term financial markets. The multilateral development banks can play a critical role in putting together projects that address the needs of savers and investors, including structuring risk appropriately. And this was, of course, part of the philosophy of the new development banks. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, I was involved in creating the BRICS Bank, which is the bank of the BRICS. And what they were looking for is, new mandates, focusing more on climate change, global public goods, new governance, problems of the governance in the and new instruments. There are problems posed by the rating agencies, which I can't get into, but which have limited their expansion. But the new development banks, both the AIIB and the BRICS Bank, are actually expanding very rapidly. So the short-term flows have a problem of instability. And that instability has been a major source of crises. Money comes into a country and then moves out. And that hot money, when it comes in, creates a bubble, a housing bubble or a stock market bubble. But when it moves out, the bubble breaks. And the exchange rate moves up and down, and it creates a lot of volatility. So one of the, when I was chief economist at the World Bank, one of my main jobs was to criticize the IMF. And they didn't always appreciate, it was all constructive, I thought. But at the time, their chief economist suggested that to advocate systems of capital account management, capital controls, ways of stabilizing, was selling snake oil, was the word he used. I got a certain pleasure. In 2011 and 12, the IMF changed their view to agree that snake oil was a good thing. They changed their institutional view about short-term capital. And it was actually, the story was actually interesting. What motivated that in part, it was partly research that showed how bad this was. It was partly a particular event. US QE had led to enormous flows of capital into some emerging markets, like Brazil, some and the result of that was the exchange rates increased. And they wanted to say, we want to dampen this flow to stabilize our exchange rate. And one of the countries which was affected was Israel. And the head of the Central Bank of Israel had been a senior official in the IMF when they were saying no to capital controls. But where you sit affects where you stand. And now that he was sitting in the position of a central bank in a country that was being devastated because their exports would not have survived if the exchange rate went up. And so they came to the IMF, at least the story goes, and said, please, can you bless us as we intervene in the exchange rate? And and supported by the research, they did that. There are other problems in private capital flows. One of them is, and this goes to the real capital flows, is that they're covered by what are called bilateral, by investment agreements. And the idea behind an investment agreement seems to be something that everybody should agree with. Investment agreements sound like they're about protecting property rights. And so the idea is that by giving protection to property rights, it facilitates more foreign direct investment, and that will help developing countries. So that was the story. But you have to be very careful in distinguishing what's actually in the words in an investment agreement versus what they say they're doing. If they're really concerned about expropriation, expropriations don't happen very often, and the World Bank and the U.S. government and many other countries have insurance policies you can buy. And so expropriation is not, if that's the risk, you can get that risk off the table at a very minuscule cost. So if they're not about that, what are they about? Well, some people say they're about discrimination, but they're not about discrimination, because if they were about discrimination, they'd be very simple. You just have a few pages and say, don't discriminate. What they're really about is trying to stop regulations. And they're trying to stop a whole variety of regulations in the environment and even on the economy, like on capital controls. The provisions have been interpreted to say that if you change a regulation in a way that hurts the bottom line, the country has to compensate you. And they can sue in a private panel, not in a public court. They can sue and create a three-person arbitration panel in which the company gets to appoint one of the three people, the government the other, and then the two agree on the third. Very expensive. These processes cost millions of dollars. When Uruguay was sued, it couldn't afford it. It was about cigarettes. And they were able to win eventually, but because Mayor Bloomberg paid their legal bills. So that gives you a picture of them. The lawyer the Canadian lawyer who wrote this particular provision, and one of the good things about the new Canadian-Mexican agreement is they've basically gotten rid of it. But the lawyer who originally wrote it said, if you pass a law restricting our putting in plutonium in baby cereals, and we had all previously done that, we will sue, and we will win. So that was, he was being a little bit overdramatic, but and he wasn't putting plutonium in baby cereal, but it gives you the flavor of what this was about. And those of you who are lawyers know this is a regulatory taking provision. And it illustrates the complexity of trade agreements because the Clinton administration had fought very strongly against regulatory taking provisions. Regulatory takings are compensation for regulations. And the danger of that is that the advocates of regulatory these compensation know that with these provisions you won't have any environmental regulations. And so it's really an anti-environmental agenda. And they succeeded in stopping this. The courts agreed, so both the legislative and the courts. But while that was going on, inside NAFTA, it was put. And nobody discussed it. And it's really, in my view, a failure of civil society as well as the administration. That these bills go to hundreds of pages. The TPP was 6,000 pages long. So, if you read that, you aren't going to be able to do your job. And that's why you need a civil society, an active civil society, to sort of identify what is going on. So the final point I make here is that it might make sense for emerging markets and developing countries to work towards a narrower multilateral investment agreement focusing just on expropriation and discrimination. How many more minutes do I have? Oh, okay. Let me. There are issues with the other aspects of there are problems with public flows, but I want to go to two things very quickly, and then. I want to go to the reversing perverse flows. One of the problems is that money has been flowing out of developing countries to developed countries. And there are two sources of these reverse flows. One of them is corruption. And, whenever there's corruption, there's always two sides to that. There's a briber and a bribee. And there's a place where the dirty money goes. And mostly it goes to developed countries. It goes to places like not just Panama and the Cayman Islands, but to the United States and the UK. And it goes not only into our bank accounts, but into our real estate sector. When a regulation finally was issued that in a few places in the United States, like New York, you had to disclose who was the owner of apartments costing more than $1 million when you did the purchase. The true owner. There was a very good New York Times story where they described one of the new buildings, and I think a vast majority of them did not have people owning them. They were all LLC people. Cayman Islands was the major owner of the building. We discovered, that some of our students also owned apartments there. So it happens when you're a private university and you have to have fee-paying students. So we understood why they were always so well dressed. But the point is that by giving safe haven to these places, we are actually facilitating this corruption. We are facilitating the money leaving the country. If they had no safe haven, there wouldn't be. It would impede this flow of money out of these countries, and the magnitude of these flows out of the country is greater than all the foreign aid that we give it. So this is, I think, important. The other one is intellectual property rights. Now, intellectual property rights are part of the global innovation system. The question is getting them right, getting the right balance. I mentioned before the intellectual property rights provisions of trade agreements, how they deal with biologics. We have in the United States a patent law that says you get 20 years. But in the trade agreements, we have provisions that extend the effective intellectual property rights through provisions, technical provisions called data exclusivity and other evergreening, and you extend it. So The argument is, and the result of that is over the last 20 years, the magnitude of the flow of money out of developing countries and emerging markets to developed countries to pay these intellectual property rights has become a significant amount of money. So I think there's a need to rethink the global intellectual property regime. The provision in WTO governing this, called TRIPS, was not designed to advance progress in science and technology. I was in the administration when they designed it, and it was very clearly driven not by a concern about innovation broadly, but by the interest of the pharmaceutical and the entertainment industry. And I think this is a good moment to rethink the rules, especially important in health. So let me go on. I want to spend just a few minutes on the research agenda. Much of the policy agenda, the policy economic agenda, has been based on a set of conventional wisdoms which are not well supported by either theoretical or empirical research. And I want to give you two or three examples. And the point of this is to emphasize, in some ways, how little we know and how important the scope for research is in all these areas. So the one that, the first one has to do with free trade. The idea that free trade is a good idea, free trade is Pareto efficient, is everybody benefits, is so ingrained in economists, going back to Ricardo and Smith, that to challenge it, you will lose your union card as an economist. But it actually turns out that the proving that free trade is good for everybody, it's only true under very restricted conditions. For instance, one of the things I did a number of years ago was to show if there are imperfect risk markets, opening up trade, making trade free, could make everybody in all countries worse off. So it wasn't that it was making just a question of distribution. It could actually, and the reason intuitively is that opening up markets increases risk. And when people face more risk, they will reduce the amount of risk-taking. Risk activities may have higher returns, and as they reduce their risk activity, incomes go down across the board. And you look at the whole equilibrium of the whole global economy, and everybody in all the countries are worse off. It was a very idealized model, but it was made to make a pedagogic point that our belief that free trade is good for everybody is really conditioned. We don't think about the underlying assumptions. One of the things that we should have learned from what's happened in the last 35 years is that without government redistribution, trade liberalization may make workers, especially unskilled workers, worse off in developed countries. Now, that was a theorem that Samuelson and Stoper proved in the 40s. So we all should have known about it. The intuition is very, very simple. If you're importing goods from developing countries, they're going to be more labor intensive, more unskilled labor intensive. And if trade is roughly balanced, you're going to be exporting capital intensive. So the demand for labor, unskilled labor is going to go down. And if you believe in normal downward sloping demand curves, with the demand going down, wages are going to go down. It's really that simple. And Samuelson's theorems were a little bit more complicated, but the intuition is really very simple. So it should have been obvious that trade liberalization with developing countries was going to have a negative effect on unskilled laborers if we didn't do anything about it. So it was true that the size of the economic pie would be bigger, and with a bigger economic pie, everybody could have been made better off, but that requires doing something. And unfortunately, the kinds of things that were proposed, like trade adjustment assistance, were resisted. And we didn't do enough of it. Got a little, but not enough. I sort of have pondered why did some of those in the corporate sector oppose trade adjustment assistance? You would have thought it was in their political interest to get everybody aboard, make everybody better off, and then there'd be even more support for trade liberalization. But there was another agenda. It was, again, reflects a short-sightedness that we often see in our economy, which is with wages low, the effect of less demand on labor is lowering wages. And what they saw is the short-term gain of lower wages. They got lower wages abroad, and they got lower wages at home. And lower wages mean higher profits. So they had a short-sighted interest in opposing this trade adjustment assistance and making the workers worse off. Well, there are other difficult issues going forward. What are the policies that are required to ensure that trade liberalization benefits most citizens? Are there such policies? What should we do if there aren't? How do we liberalize among countries with fundamentally different values? Values get reflected in our rules and regulations. Different values thus lead to non-tariff barriers. What degree of harmonization is desirable? Two examples. GMO. In Europe, they feel that GMO is not safe. Most Americans have been persuaded that they are safe. I'm not going to answer the scientific question whether they are not, but the issue is, in Europe, they think, because their citizens think that GMO, they have the right to know whether wheat is genetically modified wheat. But the US says, if you let people know that the wheat is genetically modified, which all American wheat is, it is a trade barrier, because nobody will buy American wheat. So we've been arguing that people shouldn't know. Transparency is a trade barrier. Now, you can see from the way that I've phrased this that I'm probably not supportive of this view. But an issue that is really becoming very global now is the issue of privacy standards in digital economy. And it's very clear China has different standards than we, and we have different standards than Europe. And this may have very big consequences for the new technologies, AI, and how are we going to have a trade regime? So my view is we need to have a multilateral discussion. There are still benefits from trade, but a naive view that, these things don't matter, I think is going to be wrong. We will have to come to terms with that. I already mentioned the capital markets issue. The conventional wisdom that everyone benefits from capital market liberalization, the evidence is to the contrary, contributes to greater instability. And there are questions about the impacts of capital market liberalization on democracy and policy space. I mean, for instance, every time in the first couple elections where Lula ran for the presidency of Brazil, every time when he would run, Wall Street would get scared. They withdraw the money, short-term money from Brazil. The Brazilian currency would go down, and people would vote against him. So, we say capital market liberalization was as if it was giving a vote to Wall Street. Do countries want to do that or not? But certainly it affects the policy space. So there are important research questions of what is the nature of the trade-offs? Is there an optimal degree of openness? What are the best tools for ensuring stability of capital flows? And there is an enormous amount of theoretical and empirical research needed. And the final one has to do with intellectual property. And here, the conventional wisdom is stronger than intellectual property, the better. the irony, of course, is that most of the globalization agenda is about facilitating cross-border movements of capital, goods, and services. The IPR agenda is about restricting the movement. And as I said, it constitutes transfers from developing countries to developed. Poorly designed IPR regimes may actually lead to less innovation, with adverse effects on health and the environment. Now, that seems sort of counterintuitive, but we had a recent experiment, a natural experiment, that shows the point I just made. There was a global movement, a global attempt, a research project called the Human Genome Project to decode the human genome. And it was on target to decode the whole thing in a systematic way. But a few American companies figured out that if they could beat the Human Genome Project by a day, they could get a patent. And if you got a patent on an important gene, you could make a lot of money. And there was a Utah firm, Salt Lake City firm called Myriad, that got a patent on the BRCA genes, 2 genes that if you have those genes, you're a woman, you have more than a 50% probability of getting breast cancer. So people were willing to pay a lot of money to find out and to take appropriate action. And they charged an enormous amount for that test. And even more important than the fees that they were charging was the data they were collecting on your whole genetic structure. And that they viewed that as extraordinarily valuable. Yale figured out a better test and got some civil society groups to say, we'll pay for it for poor people. And Myriad said, no. We want our bad test, and we want our monopoly. And the result is that people died. And one of the things that I'm proud of is that I joined as the economic expert on a suit to stop this. On a suit saying with the ACLU that said it is not it should not be possible to patent your genes. You should own your own genes. And it seems obvious, but we won in the district court, we lost in the appellate court, and we won in the Supreme Court. And Justice Kennedy was... So after that, we could see what happened. And what happened was prices went down and the tests got much better. It encouraged innovation and encouraged competition. So this illustrates, but there's a lot more research, it illustrates the point that a poorly designed IPR regime can actually impede innovation. So the important research questions are about the appropriate IPR regime for developing countries and emerging markets. It's different from that appropriate for advanced countries. There are many details that makes it both an interesting and complicated question. So let me just conclude. Advances in economics have helped undermine some of the shibboleths that have guided global economic governance and uncovered the need for more research in each of the areas of globalization. But the basic insights on the importance of multilateralism and of an international rule of law remain valid. And this is especially true for developing countries and emerging markets. And finally, the U.S. now represents, I think, the greatest threat to multilateralism and the international rules-based order. And as citizens, I think we have an important obligation to try to change that. Thank you.
Stiglitz for not only a very stimulating but entertaining lecture. we have a limited amount of time for questions. And one of the hallowed traditions of the Pardee Center is that the first question has to come from a student. So there are microphones. Where are the microphones lined up? Oh, over here and here. So please come up to the microphone with your question, introduce yourself, and make sure it's brief and to the point. Okay. Are you a student?
I am actually a student.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm a retired emerging markets portfolio manager who's now studying economics. So I'd like to pursue the question of capital flows to developing countries. Many pension funds in the developed world are underfunded, and particularly in an era of low nominal and real interest rates, they're looking for return, as you alluded to. On the other hand, in developing countries, there are massive needs for infrastructure finance. But we've not been able to put the two together, despite the presence of institutions like MIGA, which you alluded to. I'd just be interested in your thoughts about what mechanisms might be possible to put into place to facilitate those flows, which would be win-win for both parties.
Yeah, I alluded to that a little bit. I think the multilateral development banks can play an important role in, you might say, developing the projects, and then using structured finance is a bad word these days, but using structured finance, being able to maybe keep a small fraction on the bank's balance sheet, but mostly put it off into different categories of debt. Some safe enough to be put in pension funds, and others put off into other kinds of private investment. And so that when I said before that when we helped create the new development bank, that was part of the idea, that it would find good projects and then create a portfolio and sell off bonds in that portfolio or equity in that portfolio, and hopefully attract those kind of portfolio flows. And it was precisely that there are lots of people who are interested in long-term investments and people who need long-term investment. And we were hoping that the multilateral development banks could play that intermediation role. And there are a number of similar ideas about creating platforms that would do this. But I think the MDBs are going to play an important role on that.
So I'm a PhD student in political science. So I'm also a student. And my research project actually is quite about your first research agenda. So it's free trade beneficial for all, right? And I have a hypothesis for this. I think only those who benefit from the free trade would say so, right? And throughout the history, we can see actually those hegemons would actually kind of advocate free trade. So, for example, in the UK, when UK was very much of a hegemon, then UK advocate actually for free trade. And later, US actually was not always the champion for multilateralism, because before Second World War, US was very much for isolation, right? And federalism was very much well accepted here in the US. So I think I was actually, I'm a Chinese student. I was trying to see if actually there is a power transition here between US and China. And China actually, while US is now, these days, under Trump, having this protectionism, right? China is very much for globalization, even though the globalization we advocate is a little bit different from Western kind of globalization, but the public opinions and the official narratives is very much for globalization. So I'm actually having a hypothesis that the trade war is a signal for the power transition between China and the U.S. What do you think?
Well, I think that, as I said, free trade always has had distribution consequences. And that means there are winners and there are losers. And obviously, the winners are the big advocates of it. And within the developed countries, the hegemons, as you call it, the fact that the winners in the corporate sector, for instance, have a lot of influence and have defined the debate, and that economists made a convincing case that it made the pie bigger. But they didn't explain that just making the pie bigger doesn't make everybody better off. It actually can make some people worse off unless we do something about it. So the argument, the anti-free trade in the United States, I think, is a result of the fact that we overestimated the overall benefits and we underestimated the distribution benefits, and that actually a lot of people were made worse off as a result of free trade. Now, you will hear from some quarters in the United States that most of what has gone on has to do with technical change. We would have had a problem of our industrial heartland even if there had been no trade, if there had been no globalization. I think that's true. But I think globalization has exacerbated what would have already been a problem. Now, for a developing country, and China has been the most successful of the developing emerging markets, the argument against free trade has to do, the long-standing argument on what is called the infant industry argument, and I've rewritten that more precisely as the infinite economy argument, that you can catch up with the frontier by learning by doing things, and that you need some protection in the earlier stages of development. So I would say the differences are, related to what you said, but it has to do with the fact that the economics of development are that it becomes almost obvious that you need some protection for developing countries, and that the United States had tariffs in the 19th century, and Korea succeeded in part because, tariffs by themselves aren't going to solve the problem, but tariffs with other industrial policies do enable you to catch up. And if Korea had had a free trade, it would have wound up doing what was its comparative advantage at that point, which was growing rice. And they would have been probably the best rice grower in the world, but they would not have been the industrial might that they are today. So I think the argument for protection is different for developed and developing countries.
Okay, gentleman in the middle. Yep.
Hi. So, despite looks, I also am a student. I just finished my master's here, and I'm going to be starting in the fall at Northeastern for my PhD. So, I was wondering if I could convince you to weigh in on the nomination of Richard Moore.
Stephen, yeah.
Sorry, I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry, Stephen.
Yes. Well, I don't know him, so But I don't think any economist knows it.
That's enough.
And that may say something. And it has been, the irony that Peter Diamond, who had a Nobel Prize, could not get through the Republican Senate. And this particular person who doesn't seemingly have any qualifications other than his support for Trump, has been nominated is sort of, it's a little bit worrisome too, from what one has read. He's when the interest rate, it's sort of like Trump. Whatever Obama did was wrong. So whatever was done before, when the interest rates were low, he said they should be high. So in the period of after the 2008 crisis, I think he was criticizing the low interest rates. Now that we're at full employment, he's criticizing the high interest rates. 2.5% is not that high, but he's criticizing those high interest rates. In a context where we have near full employment. I don't think we're at full employment, but near full employment. One of probably the largest peacetime deficit that we've ever had at this stage, at this close to full employment, which raises questions about intertemporal distribution, intertemporal equity.
So let me mention that now the floor is open for non-students as well. We have about 5 minutes left, so really keep it very brief and to the point. The back.
Thank you again for that great discussion and lecture. I've read a lot of your work, and it helped to fuel my recent research in Germany, where I spent a few years there actually looking at German law and the impact of social and economic policy change on illegal employment markets. And one of the things that I observed is that what's happening now and what you kind of see with the change in politics in Germany is that there has been a backlash against liberalizing policies, and that especially sectors like the Handwerk sector, they're actually looking more at humanism as a new type of approach to reverse a lot of the rules around foreign investment and around ways that they've kind of deregulated the labor markets. And it's been very interesting to follow because Germany has a very strong rule of law. So whenever you're talking about developing countries or countries that don't necessarily have a very strong rule of law or very strong support for regulations, what kind of tools would be available to actually help them protect some of their markets as they're dealing with changes in global trade?
Well, yeah, there are many parts to your question. I mean, let me say a key aspect of economic policy are both the rules that determine the market income and the rules that determine the after disposable income. So you take your market income and translate that into what people can consume. Germany did not, in what we call the Hartz reforms, Germany did a set of reforms that actually undermine workers' bargaining power. They don't have until recently, they didn't even have a minimum wage. And they've changed the way workers bargain, broken down sectoral bargaining. The result of that is that Germany has almost as much inequality in market income as the United States. As you know, we're the leader in inequality. We do it better than anyone else. But Germany is basically not far behind. But Germany does a much better job of redistribution and social protection and health and lots of other aspects. So people in the after-tax transfer, they're a lot more equal than the United States. Not as much as they used to be, but still a lot more equal. The systems of social protection are really important in enabling countries to absorb the shock of opening up markets. Because when you open up markets, typically what happens is jobs in the import competing sector get destroyed faster than the new jobs in the export sectors get created. So, but even if they were going on at the same pace, people have to move from the old industries to the new. So those are the two things I mentioned very briefly. One is active labor market policies to help people move from the old industries to the new. But the second one is industrial policies to make sure that the new industries actually get created. And one of the problems in many countries is a lack of finance for small and medium-sized enterprises, for new enterprises. So existing enterprises have finance, but if you have new opportunities, you have to be able to have resources to take advantage of those new opportunities. And so those are examples of things that sort of keep in balance the pace of job creation with job destruction. Some of this has to do with the pace of liberalization as well. If you do things too quickly, and that's one of the things that emerge in developing countries, when you had big shocks, the systems aren't able to cope. If we do things more gradually, systems are better able to cope with the changes.
Okay, I think time for one last question. Over here.
Hi, Professor Stiglitz. Thank you for your talk. So I'm an undergraduate at BU studying bioengineering, and your point about the Human Genome Project really interested me as a genetics researcher myself. So now with the emergence of CRISPR-Cas9 systems and directed kind of like designer genetic therapies that may be necessary to combat diseases in the future, many companies are looking to patent those and kind of privatize them. Which may put people who really need these therapies at risk for not being able to afford them or have access to them in due time. So what can scientists do to be better advocates for their science and be more active in the policy making and educating society about the necessity of having these technologies open to people?
Yeah. This comes down in part to the advocacy of a balanced intellectual property regime. Nobody's advocating getting rid of intellectual property, but it's a question of balance. And in our drug regime, our pharmaceutical regime, the Hatch-Waxman Act, which was passed in the 80s, attempted to get a balance between generics, which use the competitive market forces to get out drugs quickly, and big pharma, which does more of the research. And the result of this is that, in fact, more than 80% of the drugs are now generics. And that, without that, prices would be much higher. So one aspect of that is in the pharmaceuticals is trying to advocate for this kind of appropriate balance. In the intellectual property regime, it's the same issue. There are something I didn't talk about called compulsory licenses, where developing countries can get access to life-saving drugs. It's in the WTO in TRIPS. The United States used compulsory license. I mean, people don't. When after 9/11, there was the anthrax scare. The drug that was the most effective against anthrax is Cipro. And the German company that had the patent on it wasn't able to produce it fast enough. And we just said, it's too bad, we're going to produce it, and you will have to give us a license to produce it. And so that was called a compulsory license. but there is a when I talked about the intellectual property research regime, research agenda, there are lots of questions about what can be patented, like natural occurring genes, the length and the breadth of the patents. Scientists were overwhelmingly very active in that human gene, in that suit I talked about. The head of the NHS, the government research laboratories, Nobel Prize winner, was very active in trying to keep saying you can't patent genes, naturally occurring genes. So the scientists have been very, active in saying we need a more balanced intellectual property regime, and saying that the current intellectual property regime has been driven by corporate interest and is not a balanced regime. And they've been fighting to have a more open architecture that would actually promote more innovation than the current regime does.
Okay, thank you. Afraid we'll have to bring this to an end. Please join me in thanking Professor Stiglitz. I'd also like to thank the people who put in all the hard work to organize this event: Sarah Luttrell, Bill Kring, Rebecca Dunn, and Kelly Bankert. Okay, now all the hard work is over, and there is a reception outside. Please join us.